This is a tricky one. I did a series of polls on my YouTube channel page to get to the bottom of an age-old question, and I thought the results would be pretty clear. They weren't. What makes it even trickier is that I don't know that I agree with the majority of responses in the poll. The cynics and skeptics out there will cite these poll results as proof that everything sounds the same and it's all in our heads, but I think the diversity of responses tells a different story. So let's see if we can make sense of it all together. Let me begin by explaining what we're testing here. The xDuoo X5 Pro presents us with a very unique opportunity. Atos sent this out to me for review ages ago, and I immediately fell in love with it. What makes the XD-05 Pro unique is that it's a transportable DAC and headphone amp with swappable op amps and swappable DAC cards. At the time of its release, xDuoo offered DAC cards for the XD-05 Pro, including the stock included ES-9039 Pro DAC chip, the AKM AK4499 AK4191 combination DAC card, and also the Rohm BD34301 EKV DAC card. I covered all of those off in my review of the XD-05 Pro quite some time ago. What's triggered this video again right now is that xDuoo have now released a new DAC card for the XD-05 Pro, specifically using the Wolfson WM8741 DAC chip, or a pair of them to be precise. And so thanks to Atos for sending that DAC card out, and as always, they have no influence over what I'm going to say here. And that's especially true given that most of what I'm going to tell you about here are results that came from you, assuming you answered the poll questions. The Wolfson WM8741 DAC chip is one of those legendary DACs that appeared in many different devices, from very affordable products all the way through to super high-end DACs, CD players, etc. These days, if you look on paper, it's been pretty thoroughly superseded, but that doesn't always mean that the newer, better devices actually sound better. Or does it? Let's find out. I'm going to approach this video in two ways. Firstly, let me tell you about the listening tests and the polls. In other words, what you all thought was the best without ever actually knowing what you were listening to. And then I'll tell you what I thought and what I heard when I listened directly to the Wolfson W8741 card, the ES-9039 Pro card, the Rohm BD34301 card, and finally the AKM AK4499 AK4191 card. But we should clarify a few things before we go too far. Firstly, each listener will have their own preferences and their own perceptions. So which one of these is actually better is still going to come down to personal taste. Secondly, the playback devices used to listen to the recordings of each of these cards is also going to influence what was able to be heard and what sounded better. In other words, when people said they couldn't hear a difference between the two recordings provided, it could mean one of many things. It might mean there was no difference. It might mean that they couldn't discern a difference with their ears and their listening skills. It might mean that the recording process, which involved converting the analog output from the XD-05 Pro back into a digital format via a basic consumer level interface, has squashed some of the differences between these options. It also might mean that that person's playback change was not resolving or revealing enough to highlight the differences between the two recordings. Or it might mean that their playback chain was overwhelming the differences between the two recordings by having a very strong character of its own, such as a really nice, warm, rich tube amp setup. In other words, this is not a scientific test, and it was never intended to be. There were always going to be way too many uncontrolled variables, but I still thought it would be fun to do, and I hope you enjoyed the process of listening and responding in the polls, and now that you're going to enjoy the process of finding out what was what. In terms of how this test was put together, what I did was take a balanced line output from the XD-05 Pro and feed that into a Focusrite Scarlett 2i2 4th generation. That's a USB interface designed for recording. I chose a classical track that I recorded 4 times, once for each of the different DAC cards, and then did exactly the same thing with a pop track that I chose. I normalized the volume of each of the recordings to make sure there was no difference in terms of the volume output, and then I exported each of those recordings as a lossless FLAC file. It was at this time that I labeled each one as either option A, option B, option C, or option D to make sure there was no identifying information in the naming of the files. You then got to listen to 2 tracks at a time, option A versus option B for instance, and vote for which one you preferred, or say if you didn't hear any difference at all. And so let's look at the initial rounds. When it came to the classical track, the opinions were very evenly split. Perhaps more interesting was that many people heard no differences when comparing recordings of that classical track. That may hold some interesting relevance that we'll come back to later. And by the way, the tests are still live even at the time I'm producing this video, so some of the data I'm about to share with you may have progressed and been updated after this video has been produced. If you go and look at my community page or the posts page here on YouTube after you see this video, you might see some slightly different results. And so in other words, what I'm about to share with you is a snapshot in time of the results at the moment that I recorded this video. In round 1, option B was victorious over option A by a very small margin, and about a third of the people responding heard no difference between the 2 options. In round 2, option D took the victory by the tiniest possible margin. So tiny in fact that when I came back to recheck the data as I was producing this video, that margin disappeared and they were actually now neck and neck. That made it particularly interesting to me when I saw the results of the final round. After barely scraping through in the first round of testing, option D took a comfortable win from option B in the finals. That said, the majority of people couldn't hear a difference between option B and option D on the classical track. And I'm not going to dwell on the number of people that couldn't hear a difference for all the reasons I mentioned earlier. There are too many possible causes for that for us to ever know the actual reasons. And in reality, it's probably a mixture of all of them depending on the listener. Instead, let's focus on which DACs were preferred by people who did have a clear preference. Option A, which bowed out after the first round, scored a total of just 10 votes. Option C fared a little bit worse with only 8 votes. Thanks to moving on to the finals, option B tallied a total of 16 votes, and option D won the final round, but only actually tallied 15 votes in total between round 1 and round 2. And so option D seemed to be preferable to option B on classical music, but option B did end up with the most number of votes. I'm guessing that you are probably more interested to know which one's which. In last place in the poll was option C, and that was the ES-9039 Pro DAC card. That was beaten in round 1 by the BD-34301 DAC card from Rohm. The BD-34301 is also the DAC card that went on to win the whole thing. The other loser in round 1 was the Wolfson WM8741 DAC card. It was beaten by the AKM AK4499 DAC card, which was then beaten by the Rohm DAC card. And so it would seem that to most people, classical music sounds best with either the AKM AK4499 or the Rohm DAC card in the XD-05 Pro. But this test revealed something else that was also very interesting to me. The classical music tests seemed to create very little separation between each of the options. The margins between winning and losing in each poll was a question of 1 or 2 votes. And then there was the large number of people that were hearing no differences. The reason that becomes quite interesting is that the pop music tests played out quite differently. I changed the naming of all the files for the pop tests, and I told everybody so there was no carryover of expectations or biases from the previous rounds. In other words, if you liked option A for the classical tests, that didn't mean it was going to be the same DAC card as option A in the pop tests. And so speaking of option A, this time it was a different DAC card, but it still lost in the first round on the pop music with just 2 votes. Strangely, option C, despite being a different DAC card again, was also unlucky in round 1 again. Even though it was a different DAC card, it received only 5 votes with the pop music. As I alluded to before, what was interesting was that for the pop music tests, there were less people hearing no differences. And what that means is that there was a much clearer preference to options B and options D in the 2 different sets of tests, rather than a lot of people saying they didn't hear a difference. Looking again at the total number of votes between the first round and the final round, option D, coincidentally, was once again the winner, and that was with a total combined number of votes tallying to 19 across both rounds. That pushed it ahead of option B, which tallied a total of 13 votes. And so as you can see, the pop music examples drew out much clearer preferences from people answering the polls. I have a theory about that I'll share with you in just a moment, but first, let's reveal which DAC was which. Our loser for the pop music tests was the AK4499 DAC card, and then second to last place went to the Wolfson WM8741. That meant that the Rohm card made the finals for both types of music, but this time it fell short in the final round, and that means that the ES9039 Pro DAC card took the win for pop music. And all of this raises some fascinating questions and possibilities. Firstly, I think what this shows us is that the pop music was a clearer and easier test for people because the track that I chose for that test had a wider range of dynamics and a more diverse range of sounds. There were more different things that you could hear differences in. I definitely found it easier to tell the differences when I was doing it when I was using the pop track. And then the other possible insight that we can take from this, specifically when we talk about the different winners in each of the different tests, is that it seems we pay attention to different things and we're seeking a different type of sound depending on the type of music we're listening to. Pop music is all about rhythm and energy, and that's where the ESS DACs can excel. Classical music seems to focus people more on the richness of the sound and the overall timbre of the sound based on the comments I was seeing below the poll responses. And that's where both the Rohm and the AKM DAC cards can be stronger than the ESS DAC cards, but I am also surprised that the Wolfson WM8741 didn't go better there. Either way, I think this produced some interesting data, even if the methodology and the sample sizes doesn't give us anything too concrete. And now that you know what's what, you can always go back and take another listen to the tests. Just go to the posts page here on the channel and scroll down till you find the various rounds with the polls. However, before we wrap things up there, let me tell you what I heard when I was able to listen to each of these DAC cards by plugging directly into the XD-05 Pro. In other words, without going through the process of having to have it recorded and then played back through a completely different source chain. Because ultimately, that's the way you want to test these cards with less filtering and interference going on between you and the eventual sound. The ESS DAC card delivers a sound that's clean and crisp and just a little tiny bit sibilant listening on the Susvara unveiled headphones. The other characteristic that stands out from the ESS DAC card is how flat the soundstage is. The Susvaras don't produce a particularly deep soundstage at the best of times, but with that ESS card in the XD-05 Pro, the sound was pushed right up into my forehead. In contrast, the AKM DAC card produces a sound that's a little bit further back from me as a listener. There's also less sense of harshness or sibilance from the AKM DAC card, and each sound has a slightly greater sense of three-dimensionality to my ears. The AKM DAC card also produces a sound that's just a little bit more weighty, not that there's more bass, but that there's a bit more body to the bass that's there. And that could be caused by the filters being used by each of the DAC systems and how that affects our body's ability or our auditory system's ability to process the transients in the music. We use the specific timing of transients to better understand lower frequencies. We actually do a lot of interpretation of the sounds based on the transient timing to fill out what we can't otherwise perceive. And so that could be what's going on between the ESS and the AKM DAC card. I can't say for sure if that's why the AKM DAC card sounds as it does, but it's a theory. Moving over then to the Rohm DAC card, and it's a little bit smoother again than the AKM card. Something about it made it seem slower too, as if the tempo of the music had been dropped back by just a couple of beats per minute. I have no idea what would cause that phenomenon, but I found it interesting. And I wonder if that's why the Rohm card was beaten by the ESS card when it came to the pop tracks. There's less energy and drive from the Rohm card when compared to the very energetic ESS card. Personally, I find the Rohm card to be a little bit lacking in energy across pretty much every genre, and so I don't tend to actually agree with the poll results. But that's also why it's wonderful that we've got so many different DACs on the market with so many different types of DAC chips. You can choose the one that suits your taste and your choices of genre. In other words, you can do you. In terms of staging presentation, the Rohm card doesn't feel quite as intimate and up close as the ESS card, but I did find that it was a little bit closer to me as a listener than the AKM card. And that all brings us to the brand new Wolfson WM8741 card. Remember, this was once a legendary DAC chip. Today, I'm not so sure it still stacks up. It sounds softer and smoother still than any of the modern DAC chips we've talked about. I guess that's going to make it excellent for really laid back and easygoing listening, which is not to say it's bad or lacking in detail or energy, but it does fall short of the others if you're looking for detail and resolution and a little bit of energy. It also outputs a slightly lower voltage, and so in the XD-05 Pro I found I had to turn the volume up a little bit for the Wolfson card and then back down a little bit for the AKM, the Rohm or the ESS cards. That's one of the reasons why I made sure to normalize the volume of the recordings, because the Wolfson recording was noticeably quieter than any of the other three. And to me, as I spent more time with the Wolfson card, it sounds quite a lot like the AKM and the Rohm card, with some differences between each, but sort of a melding of both, but smoother than both. It's like a mixture of those with a little bit less resolution and a little bit less detail. I think it's a bit more spacious than the Rohm DAC is, and so it's more like the AKM card in that regard, but it's smoother than the AKM card, and that tilts us back towards the Rohm comparison. Having said that, it doesn't create that sense of slowness in tempo that I get from the Rohm card, and so therefore it's a melding of both. However, having done all the testing so far with the Susvara Unveileds, I figured I should also do some testing with a headphone that I know produces better soundstage depth, and so I reached for the ZMF Atriums. There's no doubt that the Wolfson WM8741 DAC card does produce a wonderful sense of depth in the soundstage. It's not as crisp sounding as the AKM, like I said before, but by having a little bit less treble energy, it actually delivers a little bit more mid-range insight. That's probably because the treble energy can sometimes mask what's going on in the mid-range. It draws our brain's attention to the treble instead of letting it focus on the mids. On the other hand though, the AKM card delivers more sense of ambience and nuances in the sound, so you fill out your sense of what the room was like. It's like you can hear tiny details in the sound with the AKM card that help you better understand where each sound was in space and what the overall space that those recordings were made in was like. Beyond that though, everything I've already said about each of these cards and the similarities and differences between them remained the same with whatever headphone I used. And so, where does this leave all of us? Well, the results from the poll are hardly definitive, but by combining the results from the polls, the various sentiments I read in the comments around the polls and also on other forums and other reviews that I've done, and then adding to that my listening impressions with each of these cards, I think we can cobble together something resembling some useful and helpful recommendations when it comes to choosing DACs. And this is mostly based on listening with the XD-05 Pro, but I think we can generalize a lot of this quite safely to any DAC on the market, at least in the more affordable range of things. When we get into the really expensive esoteric DACs, anything's possible, but if we're talking about the normal mainstream DACs, I think what we're about to say is pretty generalized. And to start things off, I think that one thing that tends to be pretty consistent is that if you want a crisp, clean and energetic sounding DAC, a DAC built on an ESS DAC chip is going to be a very good choice. They're not going to deliver very much layering and depth in the soundstage, but in those other ways I just mentioned, they're excellent. If you prefer a sound that's a bit more refined than that ESS energetic sound, and that provides a lot more sense of space and depth in the soundstage, that's where the AKM AK4499, AK4191 combo really comes into play. They tend to always be my go-to choice in basically any DAC that I've tried. If we're talking about an ESS versus an AKM versus a Cirrus Logic versus a Wolfson, it tends to be the AK4499 that is always my preference. Having said that, the poll results would say that I'm wrong. And so if you want more sense of richness and smoothness, with still pretty good sense of space, but a more laid back overall presentation than the ESS or the AKM, that's where the Rohm BD34301s come in. They seem to be a real hit with most people, even if I don't necessarily agree. And in the end, I'm just one person, so like I said before, you do you. Personally, I don't find that the Rohm DACs capture my heart in the same way that the AKM DACs do. But there are just so many factors at play when it comes to DACs. Which headphones or speakers you're using, how you like your sound, if it's a speaker setup, which room you're listening in, and how your speakers are placed. So many different things can play into the sound. And so in the end, there is no right and wrong here. I joke about the fact that the poll results say that I was wrong, but realistically, if you're with me and you like the AKM, that's fine. There is no right and wrong. What you like is the best thing for you. And that brings us around finally to the new Wolfson WM8741 DAC card in the XD-05 Pro, but also talking more broadly about the Wolfson being used in other possible devices that are still out there. The Wolfson DAC delivers a smoother, richer sound overall. It's a little bit like an R2R DAC in some ways, on the smoother side of R2R DACs. It's not quite as spacious sounding as many R2R DACs can be, but it's got that sense of fullness and richness and smoothness that a lot of people love. In fact, I'm quite surprised that it didn't fare better in these polls. And so I do think the WM8741 DAC card is an excellent choice still, but I also think that other DACs like the Rohm and the AKM DACs are doing a better job at much the same thing as the Wolfson used to do. But with all that said, let us know in the comments, which DAC chip do you like most and why? And yes, I know it does depend a lot on the rest of the device that the DAC chip is used in. Things like power supplies, output stages, the clocking circuit, all of those things do influence the end result and the end sound of a DAC, but the DAC chips do have a starting sound that can carry through. And so it's more about which of those starting character traits you like the most, and then how well it's implemented after that. For now, if you want to pick up the XD-05 Pro and or any of the cards that can go in it, I'll put some links down below where you can go and pick them up for yourself. And of course, if you want to find out why I love the XD-05 Pro so much, I've pinned the video review of that one here at the end for you. In the meantime though, a huge thanks to YouTube channel members, also to channel Patreon members, and of course to those of you who leave super thanks on videos like this one. And until next time, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here again soon on Passion for Sound.